This lecture relates to the Oslo peace process and to the Stockholm Channel. The Oslo peace process started with a meeting that one of the leaders of the Labour Party in Israel, Yossi Beilin, had in Tel Aviv with Thayer Larson. And Thayer offered Beilin to start some sort of a rapport between Israel and the Palestinians. And he offered FAFO, his organization, to host these meetings in Oslo. Mr. Beilin was unable to commit himself to this inter alia because the PLO was at that time illegal organization. However, one of his friends, colleagues, a person by the name Dr. Yoel Hirschfeld, voiced interest to engage with the Palestinians. And he suggested that he can make himself available for such meetings. They understood the need of the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat to have some sort of a rapport with Israel because Arafat felt more and more that he is becoming isolated and he wanted back into the scene, he wanted to be reckoned with. Why Arafat felt isolated? Well, he had no idea about the Intifada. He did not know that there are some grassroots, important grassroots within the West Bank and Gaza that are willing to weigh a rebellion against Israel. So he was not involved in all the organization of the Intifada that erupted out of the blue to the surprise of the Israeli authorities and to the surprise of Yasser Arafat in the occupied territories. Now, if the Palestinians in the occupied territories are able to wage such an uprising themselves, then there's no need for Yasser Arafat, who was at that time in Tunis, far away from the territories. So he felt that the control, the leadership, is losing his grip. He's losing it. So he wanted back to the scene. He wanted to be acknowledged and to return to be the undisputed leader of the Palestinians. And he wanted to be on the map when there are weighty events taking place, such as insurrection and rebellion against Israel. Secondly, the rise of Hamas as an alternative to the PLO further threatens his leadership. Fatah is the main organization within the PLO. It's not the only one. Arafat was the leader of the PLO and Fatah. And Hamas was threatening Fatah's reigns in Gaza and in the West Bank. So he wanted to return and to be the major representative of the Palestinian people and to fight against Hamas, then regain his own control over the Palestinians. A third factor that didn't play to him favorably was his alliance with Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Gulf War, when one day Saddam decided to go for a stroll and simply swallow another country, Kuwait, because he wanted their oil. And the world did not accept this and did not appreciate it very much. And very, very few leaders in the entire world came to the support of Saddam Hussein, and one of them was Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat felt that he is indebted to Saddam for all his support throughout the years, so he pulls himself to be with him during this rough time that Saddam had to endure. But of course, this was a major mistake that backfired because the majority of the Arab and the Muslim world condemned Saddam for his treatment of Kuwait and understood that that's not the way to behave in the international arena. So that was another factor that brought Arafat to rethink his position in the world, whether he wants to continue only as a person who is engaged in violence and terrorism, or maybe he wants to present himself as a statesperson, as someone who is able and who wishes to engage in diplomacy. Arafat was also aware of the warming relationship between Israel and Jordan, and if Israel is going to strike a deal with Jordan after Egypt, the 79 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, then this is going to isolate him even further. So that was another factor that played a part in pushing Arafat more to reconciliation. Arafat did not trust Jordan. He did not trust King Hussein. He didn't think that he's going to represent the Palestinian people and the Palestinian causes. And he thought that if there will be another peace treaty between Israel and an Arab neighbor, Jordan in this case, then this is going to isolate him even further. Also, we have to bear in mind that the Soviet Union collapsed after Gorbachev came to power. Perestroika, Glasnost, opening up to the world and dismantling the Soviet Union, leaving only Russia. We are no longer talking about a bipolar world, but a world with one superpower. And so it happened that Arafat was never a party, an ally of the United States, and he aligned himself far more with the Soviet Union than he did with the United States. He did not with the United States at all. And now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he cannot count on the Soviet Union to serve as a counterbalance against the American interests. So he needed to establish some ties with the United States, and one way to do this is through the establishment of relationship with Israel. He understood very well that there is a bond between Israel and the United States that cannot be broken easily, and the way to the hearts of the Americans can be a peace with the Israelis. Arafat saw that there was an opportunity in terms of the political arena in Israel. In 1992, Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister, and he was far more willing to concede a relationship with the Palestinians and possibly a compromise over the occupied territories than the Likud party that was in power for quite a long time, since 1977, for the majority of the time. There was also coalition government at some point in the 80s for 4 years, but for the major part, since 1977, it was Likud. And Arafat thought that he would be able to strike a deal comparatively easier with Labour than he could do something with the Likud. Shimon Peres, who worked with Yitzhak Rabin at the Labour Party, said, "We were not going to rule the Palestinians against their will. We were always looking for a way to liberate them from our occupation and to liberate ourselves as occupiers." So that's a very bold statement that tells you that at least part of the Israelis did not want to continue the occupation, and Arafat was cognizant of these words and these notions and this will on part of the Labour leaders to find a solution to the Palestinian problem. Now, we would like you to ask yourself, what lessons do we learn from Oslo? And what are the main achievements of Oslo? The Oslo story is quite fascinating because it was a track to success story. The government officials were not involved in the first phase of the Oslo talks. They were not in the room. The negotiations were between Palestinian representative Abu Allah and Hassan Asfour, and then there was one or two other Palestinians that came from the Palestinian side, and then from the Israeli side there were two doctors from the University of Haifa, Dr. Yair Hirschfeld and his student Dr. Ron Pundak. None of them had any official role in the Israeli government, and there was some sort of a facade of doing academic work together between Israelis and Palestinians under the auspices of FAFO, Trial Larsen organization. But there was not much expectation that this is going to lead to some sort of a breakthrough. These four people, Abu Allah, Hassan Asfour, Hirschfeld, Pundak, met several times in Oslo. Each time they met for 2 or 3 days. They return, and together they consolidate some sort of a paper. And after a while, Hirschfeld thought that he may have something that is tangible, that's something that it will be possible to work with. So he brought the draft document that he comprised together with the Palestinians to Yossi Beilin and asked for his opinion. Beilin saw the document and he recognized that there is some good points in it. There's some basis to do something together with the Palestinians. He thought this was a breakthrough. Until that time, nobody else, with the exception of Yossi Beilin, who was deputy foreign minister, nobody in the government actually knew about the Oslo process. Nobody knew about the Oslo process because Yitzhak Rabin, when he became prime minister, he nominated Shimon Peres, his great rival, to be foreign minister, and he forbade him to be involved in any peace negotiations with the Palestinians. And of course, Yossi Beilin was fully aware of this, so he took the responsibility upon themselves. And this is a huge responsibility to take, because he knew that if he's going at the start to come to Shimon Peres and tell him about this, Shimon Peres would reply, I cannot do that. I am not allowed to do that. Yitzhak Rabin forbade me from doing this. And he will have to go to Rabin and ask for his permission. And the likely result might be that Rabin would tell him, you don't have any permission. I explicitly told you not to engage, and now you engage against my explicit order. So therefore, Yossi Beilin, who did not think much of this path that was constructed in Oslo, he took the responsibility for himself and did not tell anybody. He didn't say this to the foreign minister, to Shimon Peres, and of course he didn't tell Yitzhak Rabin or any other person in the government. But now, after several talks, and now that they have this document, Israeli Palestinian document, he thought there is something there. And this is when he went to Shimon Peres and said, Shimon, I have a document, I want you to read this. And when Shimon Peres read the document, he acknowledged that there is something. And then, quite anxious, he took the document with him and went to see Yitzhak Rabin. And he told him the story, he told him the truth, that he didn't know about Oslo, he did not know that this was going on. But now that it is done deal, there is such a document, maybe it is possible to build something positive on it, notwithstanding the bad blood that they have between them. And Rabin listened and said, okay, let it leave that document with me, I have to think about it. I want to sleep over that and make a decision. And then he made the decision not to stop it, but to maintain it, to see how it's going to be evolving. So the two of them met again, and Yitzhak Rabin said, now it's time to bring the big players. So with all due respect to Yair Hirschfeld and Ron Pundak, these are not government officials. These are two academics, they're amateurs. We need to have people who are experienced in negotiations, experience in law. None of these two people, Hirschfeld and Pundak, is a lawyer. We need to have lawyers into the room, and we are going to elevate the entire process. And this is when they called Yoel Zinger into the talks. Now, Yoel Zinger at that time was a private lawyer in Washington. So come to think about it, Oslo was constructed by two academics from the University of Haifa and by a private lawyer from Washington. This is quite an extraordinary sort of affair. Zinger gave some sort of a pretense to his partners in Washington, said that he has to come, he must go to Israel. And in Israel, he met with Yossi Belin. Yossi Belin deposited this document with him and asked him what he thinks about the document. And he told him, you cannot scrap it. You have to deal with that. So you can improve that, but you cannot scrap it. Zinger went to his hotel room, read the document. He did not like it. But he did not want to cancel everything. He thought that it is very good that Israelis and Palestinians are talking to each other. But he thought that this document can be improved much more, because many things are not said in this document, and it's not clear, it was not clear to Zinger what is the meaning behind the words. He's a lawyer, he's a very sharp lawyer, and he wanted everything to be ironclad and explicit in the document. So he wanted to transform this document. And with this message, he came to Beilin and then to Peres and Rabin and said, you know, it's a start. I have some questions, but we can build on that. So then it was decided that Zinger is going to go to Oslo with Hirschfeld and Pundak to continue the talks. And because Zinger was considered to be a Rabin man, Zinger used to work with Yitzhak Rabin during the 1980s when Zinger was a lawyer, an army lawyer. And Zinger, more or less, is the one who devised the autonomy plan for the Israeli government in the 1980s. This is following the Camp David talks between Israel and Egypt, and the autonomy plan that was constructed after the talks in 1979. So he knew a lot about the autonomy plan, about plans for some sort of sovereignty, limited sovereignty in the West Bank. And this is why Rabin trusted him. He knew him from the army, and he thought that he can deliver. He knows what are the issues. He knows what is important to him personally. Security, of course, is very, very important for Yitzhak Rabin, and other issues, and he thought that he can deliver the goods. Now, because there was a major rivalry between Peres and Rabin, Peres also wanted a man of his in Oslo, and this is why he suggested that there would be a fourth representative for Israel, official representative, and this is Uri Savir. Uri Savir was the general director of the foreign ministry at the time. So 4 people now went to Oslo in the second phase. Hirschfeld and Pundak took the back seat, and now the front seat was given to Zinger and to Uri Savir. And this is when the real negotiation or breakthrough started or was constructed. And many questions were asked. Zinger presented to Palestinians many questions that he thought should be clarified, and clarified explicitly in writing, not intentions, but clear statements. And this is when the Oslo Accord came about. And one of the most important parts of this Oslo Accord is the mutual recognition document, because it's the first time that the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is recognizing Israel and vice versa. So there was mutual recognition, that's one of the components. But it was clear to Zinger and to all the other parties in the Israeli delegation, with Savir, Hirschfeld, Ron Pundak, that this is not the full deal. It has to be done piecemeal. It is a starting point, and you don't want it to fail at the beginning. And therefore, the idea is to agree on what is relatively easy to agree, to recognize each other, and then you start a process, and then during the process, you are going to tackle the more important issue, like refugees, Jerusalem, Temple Mount, settlements, security. All these issues are going to be tackled and compromised over. And the idea that is at the end of this process, there's going to be some sort of Palestinian entity in the West Bank and Gaza alongside Israel, that Israel is going to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, at least the Israeli army. There's the issue, of course, the settlements that remains and was not decided, but there will be more leeway for the Palestinians to have some form of self-governance, autonomy plus, maybe some sort of sovereignty. I should also mention that at the time that the Oslo talks were conducted, there was an official path in Washington, D.C., when official government representative headed by Eliakim Rubinstein were trying to negotiate some sort of agreement with Palestinian representative, not the PLO, because Israel at the time did not recognize the PLO, but there were representatives of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but they took order, of course, from the PLO, so often they will go out of the room and say, we need to make a phone call, and they will call Tunis, Yasser Arafat, and ask for orders or for instructions how to proceed. I can tell you, I met Eli Rubinstein. He was not happy when he discovered about Oslo, and he discovered about Oslo when Rabin called him one day and told him, Eli, I want to tell you that alongside Washington there was another channel, and the channel is the Oslo channel, and they reached some sort of agreement, something that Eli Rubinstein was unable to secure. So here you see the climax of the Oslo channel when there was the signing of documents, and it was decided that the signing of document will gain the American official recognition, and that the ceremony will be in Washington. And it was conducted at the White House lawn and presided by President Bill Clinton. And here you see the two arch rivals who were trying to kill each other for so many years, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, shaking hands for the first time. And I can tell you it was not easy for Yitzhak Rabin, not easy at all. Oslo was a breakthrough. For the first time, Israelis and official representatives of the Palestinian Liberation Organization sat with each other. And for the first time, the Palestinians are represented by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So that was a major thing that Oslo did. Oslo saw some success, not great success, but limited success, because both Israel and the Palestinians wanted to harvest some fruits and to move forward away from violence, more towards reconciliation. Both sides wanted to reach a deal, even a limited deal, and this kind of determination is extremely important, and this was the main lever, if you like, for the success of Oslo. Certainly the convivial atmosphere that was generated by the kind Norwegian was conducive to the negotiations. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians wanted to come to Oslo. None of them felt coerced by any side to come to Oslo. They came of their own free will, and I explained that there were main reasons for both of them. to see that it would be successful. They wanted to learn from each other and to know each other personally, and to construct some sort of relationship, some sort of rapport that they hoped that slowly but surely would lead to a full-fledged agreement. I mentioned that Hirschfeld and Pundak, two political scientists from the University of Haifa, were not official representative of the states, and they never studied negotiation as such. When you do high-flying negotiations, you need to have expertise, and this was noticeable from my discussion with Yoel Zinger, who said that it would have been easier for him to scrap the document that Hirschfeld and Pundak did and start from fresh than to try to correct or to amend what he called or what he termed a bad document. So there's no substitute for professional negotiators in the room. They are irreplaceable. And of course, when you are doing some momentous event like this, peace between Israel and the Palestinians, you need to have the knowledge and the attention that only experts can bring to the table. Another lesson concerns the third parties, facilitators, mediators. The Norwegians were not mediators, they were facilitators. They were outside of the room during the negotiations. They knew exactly what the role is, and they accepted it. I interviewed the Norwegians as well, and they told me that they would meet during lunch and dinner, but also then they did not discuss politics. They would discuss everything but politics. So the Norwegians were fully aware of the limitations, and they knew that they don't have any leverage, certainly not over Israel, to force them to do something that Israelis do not want to do. They just wanted to be the kind hosts who bring the two sides together and facilitate the discussion, and they were happy to do this, and just this. They had no ability to press the parties, and when it comes to the real tangible issues, those that tear the Palestinian and Israeli apart, not only between them, but also inside their own people, like Jerusalem, like settlements, Temple Mount, and so on, refugees. For this, you need to have an external sort of a power who has leverage over both sides. And at present, it seems to be that the only party that has such leverage over the Israelis and the Palestinians is the American. So a good model to follow is possibly the Camp David summit between Israel and Egypt that was successful. Oslo was done in secret. Very few people knew about Oslo. I'm not talking about the public. Very few people in the government, very few people in the Prime Minister office, very few people in the Foreign Ministry knew about Oslo. And all the people that I interview about Oslo, dozens of people from 6 countries with a lot of experience in peace talks, they believe that secrecy at that time was instrumental and important. While no leader wants to be perceived as a thief in the night, at the same time, if you were to bring the news to the people that such a thing is happening, it might be the case that they would not be able to pull this through because there would not be enough public support. There's a need to build some sort of a narrative that will explain and justify and provide the anchors to explain the benefits for the people as a result of such an agreement. So apparently there is room for secrecy at the initial stages of the negotiations. Otherwise, it might all collapse right at the beginning. It is very important to be aware of spoilers and address the challenge. Oslo, to a large part, the Oslo process did not materialize as a result of spoilers. And there were spoilers on both sides. There was Palestinian spoilers who took violence and resorted to terrorism and killed scores of Israelis in atrocious attacks, suicide attacks, that took many, many lives, dozens of people's lives, and injured thousands of people. There were more major spoilers because many Israelis started to ask themselves, is this what we signed for? Are you seriously calling this peace? This is not peace, this is terror. And also, on the Israeli side, there were terrorists who wanted to derail the process. There was Baruch Goldstein, who entered the cave of the patriarch, the cave of Machpelah, with his gun, and there were people praying inside the cave in the morning prayer. And on that harsh day, he killed 29 innocent Palestinians who just prayed inside the cave. And this atrocious murder rattled the peace process because it's brought about more violence, retribution violence by the Palestinians against the Israelis. And then I should also mention the 4th of November 1995, this harsh day that I would never ever forget. The evening in which an Israeli zealot approached Yitzhak Rabin in the end of a protest that called for peace and against violence, and from a very close range he shot him 3 times in the back, and a couple of hours later Yitzhak Rabin died. And with the death of Yitzhak Rabin, more or less Oslo died. So we need to be very cognizant of spoilers. We need to understand our limitations, and we need to understand how crucial it is to put spoilers on check and ensure that they are not going to derail the process. Oslo paved the way for some collaboration between Israel and the PLO on very important civilian and security matters. There were hundreds of meetings between Israelis and Palestinians on many levels, attending to mutual problems and finding mutual solutions to obstacles that disturbed the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. Oslo brought about a lot of grassroots organizations work operating in the West Bank, trying to bring about a more peaceful reality. I've said time and again, one scar on the wall is just one scar. But if you have many thousands of scars, millions of scars, building from bottom up, then eventually there won't be any walls anymore. So these small steps are important. They can bring a lot of change, and they pave the way for increased trust between the two sides and eventually for peace. There were further negotiations between 1994 and 1996, and then between 1999 and 2000 in Stockholm, when Israeli and Palestinian officials met under the auspices of the Swedish and tried to build something and to agree on something. One of the major problems that was a major obstacle for the Stockholm Channel was the different ideas of how to conduct these negotiations. Because the person from the Palestinian side was in charge of the peace file or the negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians was the second in command, second to Yasser Arafat, which is Abu Mazen, the present president of the Palestinian Authority. And Abu Mazen thought that unofficial track 2 negotiations are instrumental and important at that point of time, rather than to put officials, government officials, politicians in the room. He believed in track 2. However, his counterpart on the Israeli side, which was Ehud Barak, the Israeli prime minister, said that unofficial representative, they don't really represent. They lack the responsibility, they lack the ability. And if you want to move things forward, then you must have politicians in the room. So he insisted on track 1. And the two sides simply did not see eye to eye, and they never reconciled their differences. Abu Mazen insisted on track 2. Barak insisted on track 1. So there was no will on either party to pursue peace, because Abu Mazen would send his unofficial men and Barak would not recognize them, and Barak would send his official men and Abu Mazen wouldn't like to deal with them. So it didn't lead to significant changes. However, the documents and the points that they discussed, many of these points were later considered in Camp David 2000. So it was not a total waste of time, but certainly Stockholm did not bring about the breakthrough that people hoped that they may yield as a result of that. I want you to think, what are the issues to be resolved between Israel and the Palestinians to bring about peace? And what is the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? What do you think is the most doable, just, reasonable solution to the conflict that cost so many lives, that has been so protracted and so bloody between these two people, Israel and Palestine? Thank you very much.